A single photograph captured the defeat of a global superpower, but almost everyone who looks at it gets the story completely wrong. You have likely seen the image, a line of desperate people climbing a precarious wooden ladder to a tiny helicopter perched on a narrow rooftop. For decades, textbooks, television documentaries, and newspapers have labeled this image as the evacuation of the United States Embassy in Saigon, but it was not the embassy. It was a civilian apartment building blocks away, and the helicopter belonged to the Central Intelligence Agency's private airline, not the United States military. The real story of what happened on the actual embassy roof in those final chaotic hours of April 1975 is far larger, more dangerous, and more tragic than that single photograph suggests. It is a story of broken promises, frantic decisions made in smoke-filled rooms, and a handful of young Marines left abandoned on a rooftop as an army closed in. In the spring of 1975, the capital of South Vietnam was a pressure cooker waiting to explode. As North Vietnamese divisions advanced rapidly toward the city, the American leadership in Saigon found itself trapped between two impossible choices: initiate a premature evacuation that could trigger a nationwide panic, or wait until the very last second and risk leaving thousands of allies behind. The man at the center of this storm was Ambassador Graham Martin, a career diplomat who refused to believe the end was imminent. His stubbornness set the stage for one of the most frantic and visually arresting evacuations in human history. To understand how the world's most powerful nation was reduced to fleeing from its own embassy roof, we have to look past the famous photograph and step inside the compound walls during those final, desperate 48 hours. What we find there is not just a military retreat, but a profound human drama, where every seat on a helicopter was a literal choice between life and death. Why did the United States wait so long to pull out? How did a highly coordinated military superpower find itself reduced to burning millions of dollars in cash on an embassy lawn, while its own allies screamed from behind locked gates? To answer these questions, we must go back to the weeks leading up to that fateful April day, when the illusion of a lasting peace finally shattered. We must examine the deep-seated political calculations and the human blind spots that turned a planned withdrawal into a historic scramble for survival. To understand the desperation of the 29th of April 1975, we must look at the rapid collapse of the South Vietnamese state over the preceding months. The Paris Peace Accords of 1973 had resulted in the withdrawal of all American combat troops, leaving South Vietnam to defend itself with only financial and logistical support from Washington. However, by 1974, that support had been drastically reduced by a skeptical United States Congress, which slashed military aid and restricted fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. When the People's Army of Vietnam launched its major offensive in early 1975, the South Vietnamese forces, suffering from severe supply shortages and plummeting morale, began a rapid, chaotic retreat. The speed of the North Vietnamese advance shocked military planners in both Washington and Saigon. Key northern cities like Hue and Da Nang fell in rapid succession, often with little resistance, as panicking soldiers and civilian refugees choked the coastal highways. By mid-April, the last major defensive line at Xuan Loc, just 40 miles east of Saigon, was shattered after days of brutal, heroic fighting by the South Vietnamese 18th Division. The capital was now directly threatened, surrounded by at least 100,000 North Vietnamese troops who were positioning their heavy artillery for a final assault. Inside Saigon, a sense of impending doom hung over the sunny streets, but the American embassy remained strangely quiet, almost detached from the gathering storm. Ambassador Graham Martin was a complex, tragic figure. He had lost his adopted son, Glenn Lane, a helicopter pilot who died in the war in 1965, and he was deeply, personally invested in the survival of South Vietnam. Martin believed that any visible sign of a mass American evacuation would cause the South Vietnamese military and government to collapse instantly, triggering a bloodbath in the streets and a complete breakdown of public order. He consistently downplayed the danger in his cables to Washington. refusing to authorize a systematic evacuation of American citizens or their Vietnamese employees. Military planners at the Pacific Command in Hawaii grew increasingly frustrated by his obstinacy. They drafted detailed evacuation plans, but Martin blocked their implementation at every turn. He even refused to cut down a massive ancient tamarind tree in the embassy courtyard, which helicopter pilots warned would prevent large military transport helicopters from landing. Martin insisted that cutting the tree would send a clear signal of defeatism that he was simply unwilling to tolerate. Consequently, as the North Vietnamese forces closed their ring around Saigon, the window for a safe, orderly evacuation by sea or by commercial aircraft was rapidly closing. This tension between the State Department in Saigon and the Pentagon in Washington created a dangerous paralysis. While lower-level embassy officials quietly smuggled their Vietnamese friends and contacts out of the country on cargo planes in what became known as the Black Flights, the official policy remained one of stubborn, desperate optimism. This delay meant that when the end finally came, it would not be a measured departure, but a frantic scramble for survival. The illusion of safety finally shattered in the pre-dawn hours of the 29th of April, 1975. At approximately 4 a.m., heavy artillery and rocket fire began to rain down on Tan Son Nhat Air Base, the primary airport for Saigon. North Vietnamese shells ripped through the runways, destroyed parked aircraft, and killed 2 young U.S. Marines, Corporal Charles McMahon and Lance Corporal Darwin Judge. They were stationed at the Defense Attaché Office compound, and they would be the last American servicemen killed in action on Vietnamese soil. With the runways cratered, burning, and blocked by wrecked planes, the planned evacuation using large C-130 transport planes became completely impossible. General Homer Smith, the defense attaché, called Ambassador Martin and delivered the grim news: the fixed-wing evacuation was over. The only option left was option 4, the helicopter evacuation known as Operation Frequent Wind. Martin, still skeptical and desperate to avoid a panic, traveled to Tan Son Nhat personally to inspect the damage. Only after seeing the ruined runways and burning hangars with his own eyes did he finally accept the inevitable. He returned to the embassy and called Washington, recommending that the evacuation begin. At 11 a.m., President Gerald Ford gave the order to initiate Operation Frequent Wind. Within minutes, American Forces Radio in Saigon broadcast the prearranged signal. The temperature in Saigon is 105 degrees and rising, followed by the playing of Bing Crosby's recording of White Christmas. This bizarre signal was the cue for all American personnel and designated Vietnamese allies to immediately head to their evacuation assembly points. The reaction was instantaneous and chaotic. Thousands of people flooded the streets of Saigon, heading toward the embassy or the Defense Attaché Office compound at the airport. At the embassy on Thong Nhat Boulevard, a massive crowd of Vietnamese citizens gathered outside the high concrete walls. They held up documents, birth certificates, old employment records, and letters from American officials, pleading with the Marine Guards patrolling the perimeter to let them inside. The scene was one of overwhelming desperation. Mothers passed their babies over the barbed wire, hoping that even if they could not escape, their children might find safety in American hands. Inside the embassy gates, the atmosphere was equally tense. The massive tamarind tree in the courtyard, which Ambassador Martin had protected for so long, was finally chopped down by Marines wielding axes and chainsaws, clearing the way for the giant helicopters that were already spinning their rotors on aircraft carriers sitting off the coast in the South China Sea. By the afternoon of April 29, the sky over Saigon was filled with the deafening roar of helicopter engines. The largest helicopter evacuation in history had begun. Because the embassy courtyard was relatively small, only the medium-sized CH-46 Sea Knight helicopters could land on the rooftop pad. The massive CH-53 Sea Stallions, capable of carrying up to 50 people at a time, had to land in the newly cleared courtyard. The coordination of this massive airlift was a logistical miracle, but inside the embassy compound, it felt like organized chaos. The heat was suffocating, and the air was thick with the smell of burning paper and fuel. In the embassy offices, staff members worked frantically to destroy classified files. They stuffed thousands of documents into incinerators and oil drums, but the sheer volume of paperwork was overwhelming. Soon, charred fragments of sensitive documents were floating down over the courtyard, like black snow. In the embassy vault, officials used axes and shredders to destroy millions of dollars in U.S. currency, wanting to ensure that no cash fell into the hands of the advancing North Vietnamese forces. Out in the courtyard and on the roof, the Marines of the Marine Security Guard Battalion struggled to maintain order. They formed human chains to guide evacuees to the waiting helicopters. The process was agonizingly slow. Each time a helicopter landed, the rotor wash kicked up a storm of dust, debris, and shredded paper, blinding the guards and the refugees. The Marines had to physically push people into the cargo bays, packing them in far beyond the aircraft's official weight limits. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the situation grew even more critical. The North Vietnamese forces were now on the outskirts of the city, and their artillery was getting closer. Inside the embassy, the lights flickered and went out, leaving the compound in near total darkness, illuminated only by the searchlights of the hovering helicopters and the fires burning across the city. Ambassador Martin, suffering from pneumonia and exhaustion, walked through the corridors, encouraging his staff but refusing to leave himself. He was determined to evacuate as many Vietnamese allies as possible, but in Washington, President Gerald Ford and his advisors were watching the clock. They knew that if a helicopter were shot down by North Vietnamese anti-aircraft missiles, the evacuation could turn into an outright slaughter. At midnight, the president issued a direct, non-negotiable order. From this point forward, only American citizens were to be evacuated. The hard truth had arrived. The thousands of Vietnamese still waiting in the courtyard and outside the gates were going to be left behind. This decision devastated the embassy staff and the Marines, who had spent hours promising their Vietnamese allies that they would not be abandoned. The president's order devastated the embassy staff and the Marines, who had spent hours promising their Vietnamese allies that they would not be abandoned. Now, they had to look into the eyes of the people they had worked with for years and tell them there was no more room. The Marines began quietly moving the remaining Vietnamese evacuees away from the helicopter landing zones, concentrating them in the courtyard under false pretenses to prevent a riot. At 4:15 a.m. on April 30, a CH-46 helicopter with the call sign Lady Ace-09 landed on the embassy roof. The pilot carried a direct message for Ambassador Graham Martin from the President of the United States. The message was simple: the ambassador must be on this helicopter, or the President would order the Marines to arrest him and carry him out. Martin, realizing that his resistance had reached its absolute limit, finally relented. He walked onto the roof, carrying a folded American flag, and boarded the helicopter. As Lady Ace-09 lifted off into the pre-dawn sky, the radio operator broadcasted the code words, "Tiger is out." This signal was meant to indicate that the evacuation of the embassy was complete. However, a critical and terrible miscommunication had occurred. In the confusion of the night, the helicopter fleet commanders believed that everyone, including the Marine Security Detachment, had already been evacuated. In reality, nearly 130 Marines, under the command of Major James Kean, were still inside the embassy compound. For several hours, no helicopters arrived. Left alone, the remaining Marines retreated from the courtyard into the main embassy building, locking the heavy steel doors behind them. They made their way up to the roof, floor by floor, locking barricades as they went. Below them, the crowd outside realized they had been abandoned. They breached the gates, driving vehicles through the steel barriers, and flooded into the embassy. The Marines on the roof could hear the sounds of smashing glass and shouting coming from the floors directly beneath them. They stood on the roof, weapons drawn, waiting in the dark, wondering if they had been forgotten by their own country. Finally, just before 8 a.m., a single CH-46 helicopter, Swift 22, emerged from the morning mist. The last Marine scrambled aboard, throwing tear gas grenades down the stairwell to hold back the crowd that was breaking through the final roof door. At 7:53 a.m., the helicopter lifted off. Master Sergeant Juan Valdez, the last Marine to step off the roof, watched the embassy shrink into the distance. The American presence in Vietnam was officially over. The images of that morning would go on to define an entire era of global history. Yet, the enduring power of these visuals lies in their deep complexity and the misconceptions that surround them. The photograph, taken by Dutch photojournalist Hubert van Es, showing a line of people climbing a ladder to an Air America Huey, was not taken at the U.S. Embassy. It was taken at 22 Gia Long Street, an apartment building used by the CIA. Van Es himself spent years trying to correct the caption. But the media and the public preferred the myth. They wanted to believe it was the embassy because that image perfectly symbolized the narrative of a chaotic, desperate American flight from the center of power. In reality, the actual evacuation at the embassy was both more orderly in its military execution and far more tragic in its human cost. The United States military and its allies managed to evacuate over 7,000 people from Saigon in less than 24 hours under extreme duress. It was an extraordinary feat of logistics and bravery by the helicopter pilots, who flew for hours without sleep, navigating through heavy smoke, deteriorating weather, and the constant threat of anti-aircraft fire. But the military success could not mask the moral failure. The image of the closed embassy gates, with thousands of South Vietnamese allies left behind to face an uncertain future under the new regime, became a symbol of a broken promise. It raised profound questions about the limits of superpower intervention and the ethical responsibilities a nation bears toward those who risk their lives to support its foreign policy. The fall of Saigon was not just the end of a war, it was the end of a specific vision of American global power. It taught a generation of policymakers that military might alone cannot secure political stability, and that the exit strategy of any intervention must be planned with the same precision as the entry. The empty embassy building, looted and silent in the hours after the last helicopter departed, stood as a monument to a policy that had run out of time and options. This historic moment served as a stark reminder that in the theater of geopolitics, the final act is often written not by the generals in their command centers, but by the desperate decisions of ordinary people trying to survive. The legacy of the 30th of April 1975 continues to influence how modern nations approach foreign interventions, serving as a cautionary tale of how easily a long-term commitment can dissolve into a frantic scramble for the exit. The story of the last helicopter leaving the Saigon embassy roof is more than just a historical event. It is a mirror reflecting the enduring complexities of war, loyalty, and memory. When we look back at those dramatic hours, we are forced to confront the gap between the simplified images that make history textbooks and the messy, human realities experienced by those who were actually there. History is rarely as simple as a single photograph, and understanding the past requires us to look beyond the iconic frames to find the human stories hidden in the shadows. We want to hear your thoughts on this pivotal moment in global history. How is the end of the Vietnam War remembered in your country? And what do you think is the most important lesson we should draw from the events of April 1975? Have you or your family members ever experienced or witnessed a historical event that felt very different from how it was later portrayed in the media? Share your stories and perspectives in the comments section below. Your insights help us build a richer, more collaborative understanding of our shared past. If you found this deep dive into the real history behind the iconic images of Saigon valuable, please take a moment to hit the like button. Sharing this video with others who love history helps our channel grow and allows us to continue producing highly researched, balanced, and cinematic historical narratives. Don't forget to subscribe and click the notification bell so you never miss an episode as we explore the untold stories and complex truths that shaped our modern world. As we reflect on these events, we must remember that behind every statistic and every iconic image are real people whose lives were changed forever in a single morning. The veterans who flew those helicopters, the Marines who held the gates, and the Vietnamese families who embarked on uncertain journeys across the ocean all carry the memories of that day. By preserving these stories with accuracy and balance, we honor the complexity of their experiences. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of the 20th century's most dramatic chapters. Your support keeps these vital historical conversations alive, and we will see you in the next video as we continue to unpack the fascinating stories of human history.